When you sit down for Christmas dinner, eat a turkey instead of a horse, and call the season Yuletide, you are living inside the ruins of 10 Viking practices that the church, the kings, and the courts of medieval Europe tried to erase. And here's the thing nobody talks about. The bans didn't just end these practices. Every single one of them forced Norse society to build something new in the gap it left behind. Courts replaced duels, churches replaced sacred groves, orphanages replaced infant exposure. The bans didn't erase the Viking world, they built medieval Europe. And a shocking amount of what they built is still running today. Let's start with the most visible one, because you have almost certainly celebrated it this year without knowing what it originally was. Blot was the Norse sacrificial ritual. Seasonal, communal, and soaked, literally in blood. Animals were killed, horses, oxen, pigs. Their blood was collected and smeared on altar stones, on wooden statues of gods, and on the people attending the ceremony. Then everyone ate the sacrificed animal together and drank consecrated ale. Not fringe religion, not a cult on the margins. Blot sat at the center of Norse spiritual life, repeated at the changing of every season. When Christianization swept through Scandinavia around 1000 AD, the church had a problem. You can't just tell people to stop doing the thing their entire social and spiritual calendar is built around. So the Gulating Law, one of the earliest codified Norse legal documents, did something clever. It didn't ban the feast, it redirected it. The Yule ale toast, which had always been raised in honor of Odin, was now to be made in the name of Christ and Saint Mary. Fail to brew the ale and consecrate it properly for 3 consecutive years, and you lost your property and faced banishment. Same feast, same pig, same seasonal timing. New name on the cup. The word Yule, Jol in Old Norse, is Christmas across all North Germanic languages. That straw goat decoration you still see in Scandinavian homes and Christmas markets every December. Direct descendant of the Blot sacrifice animal. Historians who study early Christian missions have a phrase for this. Allowed people to go on doing what they had done before, but now under a Christian name. The most successful religious ban in history barely changed what anyone actually did. Now here's one that went underground for centuries instead of being absorbed. Cider was Norse shamanic magic, trance states, prophecy, communication with spirits, the ability to alter fate. Practiced primarily by women called volur, who used ritual distaffs and ceremonial songs to enter altered states and read what was coming. The seeress in the Eddic poem Völuspá, who narrates the entire fate of the cosmos from creation to Ragnarok, is a vulva. What made cider genuinely transgressive, even by Norse standards, is that Odin himself practiced it. And that was considered deeply shameful for a male god, because cider involved a kind of spiritual passivity, receiving, rather than acting, that violated the Norse concept of masculine identity so severely that men who practiced it could be legally killed for it. We'll come back to that idea in a few minutes because it connects to something even darker. The church banned cider alongside all other forms of magic: wands, staves, heathen altars, death penalty. But here's what actually happened. The practice didn't die, it fused. Magical staves that survived from Iceland and Scandinavia show pagan symbols combined with Christian crosses. Cunning women who performed healing charms started invoking saints' names alongside older spirit names. The vulva went underground and kept working, and that underground tradition fed directly into the Scandinavian witch trial hysteria of the 17th century. Sweden's major trials before 1668 were remarkable for how rarely they ended in executions. Because the folk magic tradition ran so deep in everyday life that courts kept finding themselves unable to draw a clean line. The vulva archetype is arguably the direct ancestor of the European witch figure. The church didn't eliminate the seeress, it created the witch. Now we get to the one that stopped me cold when I first read it, because it involves a specific negotiation that almost nobody knows happened. Iceland formally converted to Christianity in the year 1000 AD, but the conversion wasn't a conquest, it was a deal. Chieftains argued at the Althing, Iceland's parliament, and a compromise was reached. Iceland would become Christian, but there would be a written exemption, temporarily, for 2 specific practices that the Icelanders were not yet willing to give up. Those two practices were cider and infant exposure. Infant exposure, called utboordur, was the legal practice of leaving a newborn outside to die. The father held full legal authority to accept or reject a newborn. Children born with deformities, surplus daughters, or any infant a family genuinely couldn't feed could be placed outside and left. Those infants became, in Norse belief, draga, restless undead, because they died before being named and acknowledged. The practice was common enough that it shaped Norse ghost mythology. Iceland literally bargained for the right to keep exposing infants before agreeing to accept Christianity. That sentence should sit with you for a moment. When the church finally ended the practice, the gap it left required a structural replacement. You could no longer leave an unwanted child outside. You now needed somewhere for that child to go. The abolition of utboordur was one of the direct pressures that pushed the church to build orphanage infrastructure across medieval Scandinavia, some of the earliest formal social welfare systems on the European continent. The draga, the restless child ghost, persisted in Norse and Scandinavian folklore for centuries after the practice was banned, because utboordur had been common enough that the cultural memory didn't just evaporate. Let's talk about the warriors, specifically the ones who were outlawed not because they were ineffective soldiers, but because they couldn't stop being soldiers when the war was over. Berserkers were elite Norse shock troops who could enter a trance state of battle fury called berserksganga. Contemporary accounts describe men who bit their shields, howled, and seemed genuinely impervious to pain and wounds. They were associated with Odin worship and animal spirit possession. Bear and wolf were the primary symbols. Norse kings used them as personal bodyguards and as the terrifying vanguard of their shield walls. In 1015 AD, Jarl Eirikr Hakonarson of Norway banned them outright. Iceland's law code, the Gragas, made berserksganga a criminal act punishable by outlawry. Exile, loss of all legal protection, essentially a death sentence by another name. The reason given in the sources is specific. In peacetime, berserkers had become predators. They would challenge farmers and landowners to holmgang, the Viking ritual duel, knowing they would win. It was legalized robbery. They were using their battle state to seize property, cattle, and women through combat that ordinary people had no chance of surviving. But here's the angle that modern researchers have found genuinely significant. Clinical work on combat trauma, particularly Dr. Jonathan Shea's writing connecting ancient warrior behavior to PTSD, draws explicit parallels between berserksganga and hyperarousal states seen in combat veterans. The berserkers were outlawed not because they were a military failure, they were outlawed because they couldn't turn it off. The Vikings identified and criminalized a combat trauma response 1,000 years before anyone had a name for it. That is not a small thing. The word berserk, meaning out of control, reckless, wild rage, is a direct Old Norse inheritance sitting in your mouth right now. Here's an irony that belongs in a history textbook. One of the richest single collections of Viking Age artifacts in existence survived only because of a ban. Norse cremation burial was spectacular. The dead were placed on pyres with ships, weapons, horses, personal goods, and sometimes slaves. Fire was believed to release the soul directly to the gods. When Christianity arrived, Denmark under Harald Bluetooth around 965 AD, spreading through Scandinavia across the 11th century, the practice was banned. Christian theology required bodily resurrection. You cannot resurrect a body reduced to ash. The shift to inhumation, burying the body intact, combined with the Church's gradual discouragement of grave goods, changed the archaeological record of Scandinavia almost completely. The goods buried with the dead before conversion revealed a staggering world. Silk from Byzantium, glass beads from the Middle East, coins from Baghdad, weapons forged in the Rhineland. Viking trade networks stretched from Newfoundland to the Islamic world, and we can trace them through burial goods. After 1100 AD, that record goes nearly silent. The Oseberg ship burial, dated to 834 AD, containing 2 women, a ship over 70 feet long, and a treasure of carved objects that has never been equaled, survived because it was inhumed. Buried rather than burned. The Christian ban on cremation, applied after its time, accidentally preserved the single greatest physical artifact of the Viking Age. Now back to that idea about words carrying the weight of murder. Nid was a formalized ritual shame system. Two kinds, tungunid, verbal insults, and trenid, carved wooden effigies erected to publicly humiliate an enemy. The most extreme form was the nidstung, a pole with a horse's severed head impaled on it, covered in carved curse verses and pointed at an enemy's home. Not empty gestures. In a culture where honor was the primary social currency, nid was engineered to destroy a person's standing, their reputation, and their ability to function in society. The worst accusation possible was calling a man raga or agra, implying passive sexual submission. Under the Gulathing law and Iceland's gragas, three specific words, raga, strodin, and sordin, carried the legal penalty of full outlawry, the same penalty as murder, the same penalty as rape, the same penalty as malevolent sorcery. Say the wrong word to the wrong Viking, and the law said he was entitled to kill you for it. When enid was criminalized, the legal principle being established was profound. Words can be as actionable as physical violence. That concept bled directly into Norman and Anglo-Saxon legal traditions around defamation and slander. The English word nithing, a term for a person of the lowest possible honor, survived in English legal and literary texts well into the medieval period. Let's talk about something you probably ate last week, connected to a papal decree from 732 AD. Horses were not just animals in Norse culture. They were sacred. They were sacrificed at blot ceremonies, eaten communally as an act of religious communion, and according to Adam of Bremen's description of the temple at Uppsala, their bodies hung alongside dogs and humans in the sacred grove. Eating sacrificed horse meat was a direct act of worship. Pope Gregory III banned horse meat consumption in 732 AD, writing to a missionary in Germany that eating horses was impure and abominable. The intent was explicit: cut the ritual thread between horse sacrifice and communal horse eating. And it worked in the territories the church controlled. Remember Iceland's conversion negotiation in 1000 AD? Horse meat eating was one of the two practices explicitly listed in the written exemption alongside infant exposure. Icelanders wanted to keep eating horses. The church eventually prevailed, and that ban, issued in 732 AD, was not formally lifted until 1983, 1,251 years later. If this changed how you think about where European civilization actually came from, hit the like button and share it with someone who thinks the Vikings were just raiders with horned helmets. Make sure you're subscribed, because next week we're going somewhere just as dark. And the story is even stranger than this one.